Greetings, my name is Aleshkevich Suslov, and today I'm going to tell you about the many phases of the Rusyn language, or should I say languages. Now, full disclosure, I am not an expert on all things Rusyn, but I am very passionate about these languages, and I think it's worth talking about them, especially seeing how this year's Polyglot Conference takes place in Budapest. So I thought it would be most appropriate to talk about the languages of the Hungarian Ruthenians, as they were once called. And although I do not know Hungarian perfectly, I do know some, and I did my best to include Hungarian as much as I could. So let's get on and have a look at, well, first, a little bit about myself. I have a master's degree in chemistry, and I've been teaching chemistry at a high school for 4 years now, but I identify myself as a polymath because I'm interested in science, linguistics, philosophy, theology, and video games as an art form. I'm also a strong advocate for sustainable development, as well as neurodiversity, and I've been studying languages since I was 15 years old. And by this point, I've studied most of the Slavic languages. And I'm also autistic. I have ADHD and OSDD. So with that out of the way, let's have a look at the contents of this presentation. We will have a look at the general information about what Rusyn is, its geographical distribution, the history of Rusyn, and the state of Rusyn today. And then we will look at what Rusyn is like as a language. We will have a look at the Hungarian influence on Rusyn, as well as the phonological and grammatical features of the different varieties. And then there is also a literature and further reading section. So, general information. Обща информация. Az általános információ. What is Rusyn? Что є русинський? Mi je Rusyn? Well, that's a bit like asking what's Rhaeto-Romance, or what's Scots, what's Occitan, what's Norwegian or Arabic. Even though people tend to use a single name for these languages, they are, in fact, highly diverse groups of languages that are closely related but are still distinct. So in the case of Rusyn, they are East Slavic languages that are spread across Eastern Europe. You can see that they exist in Poland, in Slovakia, Ukraine, Hungary, Serbia, Croatia. There are also small enclaves in Romania. But there are several standard Rusyn languages, which will be the focus of our talk. Those are Subcarpathian in Ukraine and Hungary. That's also Lemko in Poland, Prešov in Slovakia, and Pannonian in Serbia and Croatia. The name Rusyn is actually not the only name that these languages and the peoples that speak them are known by. There's also Ruthenian, which is still around, even though these two names were used sort of interchangeably by various Eastern Slavic languages within the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which included Poland, modern-day Belarus, and Ukraine, and several other states. So the use of them can be a bit confusing, especially in older literature, but the way I like to use it is to call Rusyn the living languages of these peoples, and to use Ruthenian, or Old Ruthenian, for the literary language of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which later influenced Belarusian and Ukrainian. And the actual linguistic situation within Rusyn territory is highly involved, and no single ethnic group, be they Boykos, Lemkos, Hutsuls, and so on, none of them speak according to the standard language. But we are still going to be talking about the standard languages because that's much easier to find resources on, and they are, of course, in use. So let's have a look at the development of the Eastern Slavic languages. There, in the 9th to 14th century, there was a split in the Old East Slavic language into the Western dialects, which became Ruthenian, which then became Ukrainian and Belarusian, as well as the dialects that comprise these languages, as well as Rusyn, and the Eastern language, which became Old Russian, which in turn became Russian, as well as the many dialects of Russian. Whereas the Eastern dialects received more Old Church Slavonic influence, the Western dialects got a whole lot of influence from Polish, which is why Ukrainian and Belarusian have so much intelligibility with Polish, but Russian does not. And Rusyn also got a lot of Polish influence, but unlike Ukrainian and Belarusian, the dialects of Rusyn were influenced by Slovak and also Hungarian, which distinguishes it from its brethren. Now, a little bit about the history of these peoples and their language. The first Church Slavonic texts with Rusyn influence date all the way back to the 18th century. But the first grammars on Rusyn appeared in the mid-1850s. Alexander Dionisovich popularized the term Rusyn in print, and he was the one who made the first grammar of Rusyn. And there was this little country called Transcarpathia, which existed for exactly one day in 1919 before it was annexed by the Hungarian Republic. And Transcarpathia was the state organized by the Rusyns. But fortunately, the Hungarian Republic was quite lenient to the Rusyn population, and between 1939 and 1944, over 1,500 publications in Rusyn were made, which is pretty significant. But unfortunately, mid-20th century saw oppression of the Rusyns from the major states where they were situated. The Ukrainian SSR considered Rusyns a Ukrainian sub-ethnicity and enforced the study of Ukrainian as a literary language. Meanwhile, Poland did something very unusual. They deported the Rusyn population from the southern border with Slovakia and enforced the study of Polish and Ukrainian in the western part of the country where they reside to this day. On the other hand, Yugoslavia did recognize Pannonian Rusyn, their local variety, as a distinct language, which allowed this variety in particular to flourish in literature. And then in 1995, Slovakia finally recognized their Rusyn population as a distinct ethnicity and the language as an official language in municipalities with over 20% Rusyn speakers, which is pretty significant. And standardization followed in other countries. But as is the case with many minority languages, the classification of Rusyn is a matter of political controversy because both Russian and Ukrainian scholars sometimes lay claims to the language as a dialect of their language, even though other linguists consider them to be wholly separate languages. And to lighten up the mood, let's also talk about some of the famous people of Rusyn heritage. Z nami Rusyny, Irish Rusynok. One of them is actually Andy Warhol. He was born with the name Andriy Varhola. He was born to a family of Lemko workers who emigrated from a village called Mikova in modern-day Slovakia. And as you might know, he was a prolific graphic designer in the pop art movement. And he was a Rusyn by descent. Another famous artist who was of Rusyn descent was Steve Ditko. He was born to second-generation Rusyn immigrants, also in Pennsylvania, just like Andy Warhol. And he went on to co-create Spider-Man and later created Doctor Strange. And he was a Rusyn. Now, whereas those two previous examples were more so a lame claim to fame because we don't know just how much those people identified with their Rusyn heritage, this personality did, in fact, keep in touch with his Rusyn roots. That's Dionisovich. He was a physical chemist in Czechoslovakia who worked with the Czech physical chemist Jaroslav Hejrovský on developing the analytical method of polarography. An equation used in calculations of polarographic data bears his name, and this is the equation. I had to learn about this equation on my second year at university, and then later when I got into Rusyn and I found an absolutely random book by a random author on a website with Rusyn literature, I just happened to read about Vladimir Ilkovich, the brother of Dionys. And the book also mentioned Dionys and how he developed this method with Hejrovský and how he got an equation. And it was so amazing that I found a reference to something that I already knew in a book on a Rusyn journalist. You can see the reference to this book here. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's have a look at how the standardization of Rusyn went. Standardizowania. Subvaniushitash. The first Rusyn language to get its own standard was Pannonian Rusyn, which was codified by Gavril Kostednik in 1923. And then, as we heard previously, Rusyn suffered a lot of oppression in the mid-1950s, in the mid-20th century, so it took a long time for another standard to appear. And that was Prešov Rusyn, which was codified by Vasilia Bur, Anna Pliskova, and Kvetoslava Koporova in 1995, back when Slovakia recognized their Rusyn population as distinct ethnicity. It was based on the West and East Zemplin dialects present in Slovakia. The next, Subcarpathian Rusyn, which is present in Ukraine, was codified by M. Almashi and Igor Kercha in 1999. So it's actually the same age as me. Lemko Rusyn was later codified by Miroslava Chomyak and Henryk Fontansky in 2000. And by this point, there is a plethora of websites documenting the literature of the different Rusyn languages, which you can see in the list of sources. Let's have a look at the state of Rusyn today. Rusynsky dnes. Moi Rusyn. Like I said, there is a plethora of websites documenting the literature of the different Rusyn languages. You can visit some of these here. And there are also several YouTube channels dedicated to Rusyn. The most significant of those is Michal Kushnitsky. It is the biggest channel in Rusyn, and it's run by a speaker of the Berezhansky dialect. Those of you who watch Ecolinguist might recognize Michal because he has appeared on Ecolinguist multiple times. And there are also numerous channels dedicated to contributing to the culture of Rusyns in the Rusyn diaspora in America, which, as we saw with Andy Warhol and Steve Ditko, is quite substantial. So now that we've got that general information out of the way, let's have a look at what Rusyn is like. Який є русинський? Мільйон Rusyn. So, speaking of Hungarian, the most important thing and the most impressive thing, in my opinion, is the amount of Hungarian influence on Rusyn, which would be magyarský vplyv, a magyar hatás. The various Rusyn languages have acquired a lot of Hungarian loanwords, which some of which we can see here. For instance, the word to use is hosznawati in Rusyn, which comes from Hungarian hosnalny, to use. Compare that to other Slavic languages, such as Russian использовать or Polish używać. Notice how other Slavic languages use prefixes such as is, uż, but Rusyn does not have to use a prefix here. The word for judge is biro, which comes from Hungarian biro. And compare that to, say, Russian судья. We can observe that the long Hungarian O becomes O in Rusyn, because Slavic languages normally do not distinguish length, aside from Czech and Slovak, of course. The word for suitable is voloshnai, which comes from Hungarian volu, which once again we observe O becoming O, and it adds the suffix shny. Compare that to Russian podходящий or Czech vhodny. The word for surely, bizono, which comes from Hungarian bizon. Compare that to, say, Ukrainian disno or Russian tochno. The word for dragon is sharkany, which comes from Hungarian chorkany. Now, observe that the a vowel in Hungarian can be rendered either as a or in some cases as o in Rusyn, because the Hungarian a sound is famously difficult to distinguish between a and o. And as you can see, this word is very different from Russian drakon or Polish smok. The word for or, right, even a small particle like or, also got loaned from Hungarian, and Rusyns now say vod, like the Hungarians say vod, as opposed to saying ili, like in Russian, or she, like in Polish. The word for precisely is ipen in Rusyn, which comes from Hungarian ipen. And here we can observe that the long e of Hungarian becomes e in Rusyn, because in Hungarian, the length also affects quality. And whereas the short a is quite open, the long e is quite high. So it becomes closer to e. The word for some, karetei, which comes from Hungarian karet, as opposed to Polish osobny or Ukrainian okremej. The word for city, varysh, which comes from Hungarian varosh, as opposed to Polish miasto or Russian gorod. The word for master would be gazda, which comes from Hungarian gazda, as opposed to saying something like господин in Russian or pan in Slovak. Finally, the word for peace, that would be falat, which comes from Hungarian falat, as opposed to kusok in Russian or kawałek in Polish. And there are many, many more Hungarian loanwords. And it's like, I first studied Hungarian before studying Rusyn. So when I got to Rusyn, it was really cool seeing all these loanwords that I already knew due to having studied Hungarian. So anyway, all of the varieties of Rusyn have these, even the ones that are far away from Hungary, like the Lemkos of Poland or the Pannonian Rusyns of Serbia and Croatia, because, well, evidently all of these varieties came from the same source that had contact with Hungarian. So this is something in common to all of the Rusyn languages, but now let's look at the specifics of the different varieties, starting with Prešov Rusyn, Prešivsky Rusynsky, Eperjeshi Rusyn. First off, the phonetics. This letter represents the sound e, whereas this letter represents the sound e. These are the direct descendants of Proto-Slavic e and e, respectively, which can be best exemplified by the word sinei, blue. Now compare that to Russian siniy or Ukrainian sinei. Right? The qualities of these vowels are quite different, and in fact, this letter normally stands for y in Russian, and it has the analog in Belarusian, y. But in Rusyn, this vowel has changed to be further back, whereas y is a central vowel. This one became something more backed and probably a bit more centralized as opposed to the other Slavic languages. It can be transcribed either as or and then this layer represents the sound e, which came from either the yat vowel, like in the word lis, forest, compared to Old Church Slavonic les, or it could also have come from the sound e, which stood before palatal consonants, like in the word viditi, as opposed to the word vidno, where you can see the alternation between e and e because of the palatalization of the sound d. It also came from mid-vowels in closed syllables. As is perhaps familiar to those of you who know Ukrainian, you say nis for he carried, but nesla for she carried. You say nich in the nominative, but nochi in the genitive and dative. And like I said, this is a phenomenon that's also present in Ukrainian. However, in Rusyn, the alternation between the mid-vowels e and o and the vowel e is far less regular. There are plenty of exceptions, plenty of cases where this alternation does not happen in Rusyn, but it does happen in Ukrainian. But just like Ukrainian, also like Slovak, the sound g became a glottal sound. It can be transcribed either as glottal or pharyngeal, so it's something between and like in the word holos, voice. Now, what's very interesting about all of the Rusyn varieties is that the palatalized m sound became mn. For instance, the word for me is nya, which obviously came as a rose as a shortening of mnya, which came from mya, which was the word for me in Old East Slavic. And there is also the word for meat, mnyaso. Compare that to Russian, меня and мясо. Now about the grammar. There's a lot to say about the grammar. The most striking feature of most Rusyn varieties, and Prešov Rusyn in particular, is the separable particle ся. Whereas in other East Slavic languages, the particle ся is fused to the actual verb. In Rusyn, it's separated. So you would say ся отбыты, as opposed to Russian случится. This is a feature that is most likely part of the Slovak influence on the language, because Slovak also features a separable reflexive particle. The old y ending has been preserved after the velar sounds. For instance, in Rusyn, you say ruky, as opposed to Russian and Ukrainian, where you say ruki or ruky, respectively. Because in most Slavic languages, y became e after the velar sounds kg. Another very distinctive feature of Rusyn is the use of the instrumental o ending instead of oyu in a stem nouns. For instance, in Rusyn, you would say zheno for woman in instrumental and zimo, winter, as opposed to Ukrainian zhenoyu, zimoyu. The dative ovi and u distinction exists for the masculine and neuter endings, which is common with West and East Slavic developments, except for Russian, of course. For instance, you would say chlopovi to the boy, or stolu to the table, as opposed to Russian chalopu, stalu. The plural masculine ending ove, which is common with Old West Slavic. So for instance, you would say muzhave, as opposed to Russian muzhi. The old dual ending prima is now used for the instrumental for adjectives, which is a very strange development because it does not align with the ending for nouns. But anyway, for adjectives, you would say something like noema, new, as opposed to Russian novymi, right? But all the nouns in Rusyn also use the mi ending as opposed to the ma ending. And another unusual feature of Rusyn compared to the other East Slavic is the fact that it uses fully conjugated forms of byti, to be, whereas the other East Slavic languages have a singular form which comes from the third person singular, есть for Russian, ye for Belarusian and Ukrainian. And Rusyn also does not omit the copula, which are all of these are most likely features borrowed from Slovak, once again. Furthermore, Prešov Rusyn also has masculine nouns that end in o, like dido for grandpa, domisko for hut, just like Ukrainian, and also has long masculine adjectives like novi, but short, nova, noe, noe, so for all the other genders and numbers, just like Ukrainian. And it also uses short forms in the pronominal declension, which is a feature common with East Slavic. For instance, in the genitive, you say me, you would say mene, nya for the accusative, meni, mi for the dative. You could also say nyoho, o for the accusative, he, or nyomu, mu for the dative. And additionally, a very nice feature that is also present in Belarusian is the optional epenthetic n in pronouns after prepositions. For instance, you would say win for he, and for the genitive, you would say nyoho or yoho. You would say una for she, but you would say either nyoi or yei. And for they, you could say uni in the nominative and nih or yih in the genitive. And finally, a very interesting feature is the fact that Prešov Rusyn has borrowed productive nominalizing suffixes osh and ash from Hungarian osh and ash, which is pretty cool. So now that we've had a look at what Prešov Rusyn is like, let's also have a look at a text written in Prešov Rusyn. Не можеш знати, ці сучасні русини, живучи в Карпатах, суть прямими потомками руських племен, споминаних у найстарших документах угорської історії. Можемо так само предпокладати, що тото давнє жительство в Карпатах аж ані не є, що давно сплинуло на його виході з мадярами, а на западі зо словаками, а що теперішні русини в Карпатах походять з пізніших колонізацій і поступного заселяння тої території. Свідчить о тим, а й факт, що етнографічні тілки у тих краях суть прямими продовжателями таких істих тілків у Галичі і в Буковині. Під Карпатами знайдемо групи лемків, бойків і гуцулів, так як і в других країнах. So, I hope that was enough of a taste of Rusyn. And now we're ready to move on to the next variety, which is Lemko-Rusyn, Lemkівський русинський, Lemkої Rusyn. So, although it is quite similar to Rusyn, there are a few very notable differences. For instance, the vowels represented by the letters E and E are actually allophones in complementary distribution, whereas they are normally seen as different phonemes in Rusyn. A very interesting feature is that the old W consonant is actually retained in Lemko. For instance, you don't say voda, you say voda for water, like the old Church Slavonic voda. And another very distinctive feature is the fact that the L sound has now shifted to W under the influence of Polish in most contexts. For instance, the word body would be tiwo, and the word for cell would be była in Lemko-Rusyn. Compare that to Polish ciało and piła, and also compare that to Ukrainian tilo and pila. However, in contact with E and E, the former L is retained. For instance, in the word for only, lem. And this word lem is actually what gave rise to the name Lemko. And they're named that because of the word for only. And another example is the word byli, right? Which also preserves the sound L. But what's really fascinating, because Polish also has this, changing L to W. But what's really fascinating is that in Lemko, sometimes in a select few words, the previous L sound was realized as W. For instance, so it's a palatalized W. For instance, in the word miłist, for mercy, płit, for sex, as in gender, or żałobne, as in pitiful. And that's really fascinating because the sound w is very, very rare. It's sort of similar to the w, as in we in French, but I can't really name any other similar sounds in other languages. It's very fascinating that Lemko has such a rare sound. And in terms of grammar, it's quite similar to Rusyn. However, a very distinctive feature compared to other Rusyn varieties is that the masculine instrumental ending has been generalized to feminine nouns and pronouns. So for instance, in Lemko, you would say zemlom for earth, as opposed to Rusyn zemlyo. You would say mnom for me, as opposed to mno in Prashop. You would say nyom for she in the instrumental, as opposed to nyo in Prashop. So that's about it for Lemko features. And let's also have a look at a text. Sokrat Янович написав, że jak ходить по красну літературу, чоловік є неодмінний у ній приречений на рідний язик, бо лем у ним може видобити суть свого таланту. Actually, should be таланту. цілком одмінний розвивається язик наукових текстів. Само уж дефінювання, понимання науки підкреслять, що суть то знання, котрі різняться від інших форм знання, упорядкуванням, системовістю. Суть то знання спільним вшитком, котрі чинять відповідне старання, щоб їх зрозуміти. Наука – то ті ж знання, методичні, уважені для окресленого програму і принципів. То знання сформалізовані і символічні, виражені в символах, знаках, в словах язика, числах, формулах, табелях. All right. So I'm sure you noticed some similarities to Polish, especially when the L became W. Yeah, that does it for Lemko. And now let's have a look at Subcarpathian Rusyn. Podkarpatski Rusynsky. Karpatelyayi Rusyn. The phonetics are also very, very interesting here, though there isn't much to say about the grammar as it's mostly similar to the previous variety. So, U became a reflex of O in closed syllables, which is a similar development to Czech and Polish, but it's opposed to Ukrainian, which developed E in these cases. So for instance, you would say kun for horse, compare that to Russian kon or Czech kun, and you say vuz for card, as opposed to voz in Russian or vuz in Czech. But what's really fascinating is that some of the dialects in the Subcarpathian region actually have U in place of U in these cases. So there are Slavic languages that have front rounded vowels, and the Berezhansky dialects of Subcarpathian Rusyn are such languages. So for instance, they would say kun or vuz, as opposed to kun and vuz. So that's also really fascinating. Another very interesting feature is the fact that some of the palatalized labials in the start of a word disappeared. For instance, in Subcarpathian Rusyn, you would say святый for holy, as opposed to Ukrainian святый or Polish święty. You would say язати for to weave, as opposed to Ukrainian вязати or Polish wiązać. So that's quite strange. And another interesting feature is the fact that intervocal y became w. For instance, in Subcarpathian Rusyn, you say знаю for I know, as opposed to Russian and Ukrainian знаю. And you also say купую for I buy, as opposed to Russian покупаю or Ukrainian купую. So let's also have a look at a text. На городі, яку королеві називають замкову ору, уже майже 500 років стоїть каплиця. Не раз ремонтована, понищена, або зараз повністю удроджена, вона і нині повноцінно служить вірникам королівської римо-католицької конфесії. Історія її тісно пов'язана з історією самого замку Ньола. Більше того, сам замок вона надовго пережила. У 1526 році під Варишем Могач сталася битка мадярсько-чесько-хорватського війська короля Лайоша II проти османської армії Сулеймана I Пишного. У трагічній битці скитився сам король Лайош II, а з ним ще й ушиткий цвіт центральноєвропейського дворянства, у тому числі Габор Перені, тодішній власник Ньолаба. So, there are a few interesting features that we can observe here. For instance, how the name of the castle Nьолab is rendered in Subcarpathian Rusyn with O for the first A sound, but A for the second one. And you can also see that Hungarian H is rendered as A in Rusyn. That's common for all varieties of Rusyn. So we've gone over 3 of the varieties of Rusyn, and now it's time for the last standard language of the Rusyn languages, which is Pannonian Rusyn, Bajuansko-Ruski, Voidoshagi Rusyn. This is the one that exists in Serbia, close to Novi Sad, which is where the Polyglot Conference also used to take place, as well as in Croatia and Romania. So one of the few interesting features is that the reflex of the yat vowel is a palatalizing e, just like in Russian. For instance, in Pannonian Rusyn, you say chleb for bread, and compare that to Old Church Slavonic chleb. And a very interesting feature, which is actually somewhat similar to what Polish does, is that the reflex of palatalized s and z became sh and zh. For instance, the word for self, the reflexive particle, is sh, and the word for green is zheleny. Compare that to Russian, sia and zelený. And this makes some Pannonian Rusyn words very difficult to recognize at first sight. There is no change of o or e in closed syllables, as opposed to Ukrainian or all the other standard Rusyn languages. For instance, you say moi for mine, as opposed to Prashov, me. You say rovny for even, as opposed to Prashov, riuny. And an interesting feature is that the verbal ending t became ts. For instance, the word for to be is buts, as opposed to Ukrainian buti, for instance. And the verb for to gather is zberats, as opposed to Prashov, zberati. So those are a few of the features of the phonetics, but there is much more to say about the similarities of the phonetics with South and East Slavic languages. For instance, the former I sound merged into E, which is a common development with all the other South Slavic languages, of which Pannonian Rusyn definitely acquired influence, being in that region. It's also common with Czech, Slovak, and Ukrainian. For instance, in Pannonian Rusyn, you say mydlo and dim, for soap and smoke, respectively, as opposed to Russian, which preserves I, where you say mylo and dim. In Pannonian Rusyn, there is no epenthetic L, which is a common feature with East and South Slavic. For instance, the word for earth is zhem. And this is one of those cases where it's very difficult to recognize the word at first sight because it looks nothing like Ukrainian zemlya. But if we recall the fact that the palatalized z became zh and there is no epenthetic L, yeah, that does look like earth now. And then the very, very fascinating part is that the liquid diphthongs metaphesize in a distinctly South Slavic or Czechoslovakian manner. For instance, in Pannonian Rusyn, the word for gold is zlato, the word for coast is breg. Now compare that to Russian zoloto and bereg, and Croatian zlato and rijeg. Pannonian Rusyn forms are much closer to Croatian as opposed to Russian, and indeed, the Russian forms are representative of all the other East Slavic languages, and the metathesis of liquid diphthongs is a very important part of categorizing Slavic languages. So the fact that Pannonian Rusyn does not share this core feature of East Slavic is actually cause to doubt its inclusion in East Slavic in the first place. But that's a story for another time. Pannonian Rusyn also conserves the final l in masculine past participle endings, as opposed to all the other Rusyn varieties and Ukrainian. In Pannonian, you say robil for he did, as opposed to Prashov robil. The adjective ending y became I, which is also common with all the other South Slavic languages. For instance, in Pannonian Rusyn, you say ruski for Rusyn. Compare that to all the other South Slavic languages, which say ruski, except of course, to those languages that means Russian and not Rusyn, but in Rusyn that means Rusyn. The clusters tl, dl have been conserved which is a common development with East Slavic. Like I said, the word for soap is mydlo, whereas in Russian, the dl and tl simplified to l. And in Russian, you say mylo. Likewise, clusters kv, gv are conserved, which is also a common development with East Slavic. In Pannonian Russian, say gvizda for star, kvitse for flower, as opposed to Russian zvezda and cvetok. And compare that to the Polish gwiazda and kwiat. So that does it for phonetics. There's less to say about grammar. The interesting feature is that genitive and locative plural ends in och, which is similar to the locative case ending in Slovak. For instance, in Pannonian, you would say ptitsoch for birds and psoch for dogs. Compare that to Russian ptits in the genitive plural and ptitsach in the locative plural, and psov and psach for dogs. And Pannonian Rusyn also features the dative plural ending om, which is common for both East and South Slavic. For instance, in Pannonian Rusyn, you say tsetsom for kids, as opposed to Russian detyam. And it also features the separable reflexive particle she. For instance, you would say ya she uchu in Pannonian Rusyn, as opposed to Ukrainian ya uchuся. Well, that does it for the interesting features of Pannonian Rusyn, and now we're ready to read a text in it. Перша група проблемів виходить з метеодношення морфологічного і фонетичного принципа писання слова, те є від домінування вплива етимології або ортоепії на ортографію. У вводнім слові правописа руського язика М. Кочиш пише, морфологічний принцип, котрий маємо в основі нашого писання, одразує, що не записуємо слова так, як їх виговоряємо, але в писанню вводимо рахунку, як слово настало. Приклад, який дава то префіксоване слово розсипаць, не розсипаць. Олександр Дуличенко, між тим, констатує слідуюче. Морфологічний принцип, котрий става головний, доповнює ще з другими ортографічними принципами. Один з них то і фонетичний. Потім фонетичний принцип доповнюється, а не примарний, як у сербському язику. So, that's all I have to say about the different Rusyn languages. So let's go on to the summary. Заключення. As we learned, Rusyn is not a singular language, but a collection of closely related languages. The different Rusyn languages have a firm East Slavic base, West Slavic influence in their morphology, syntax, and lexicon, as well as noticeable lexical Hungarian influence, with Pannonian Rusyn also exhibiting many South Slavic features, which kind of makes it the ultimate Slavic language because it received influence from all three branches. And the four standard languages, Prashov, Lemko, Pannonian, and Subcarpathian, are well established with a wide variety of literature, but the languages are still in their early stages of adoption. And as we saw, even the standard languages display significant variation, to say nothing of the actual languages spoken by Rusyns. That does it for my talk, and you can direct any questions about Rusyn and Slavic languages in general to my email addresses. So, thank you all for your attention. Дякуємо за увагу. Köszönöm szépen a figyelmet.